The ship went down in 1592. It was an English warship, part of a fleet engaging Spanish forces. It sank off the coast of Alderney, one of the Channel Islands. For centuries, it lay on the seabed, its story forgotten. Divers found the wreck in 1977, where they brought up cannons, muskets, and everyday items from the sailors' lives, and they found one very strange object. It was a cloudy, rhombus-shaped crystal. It was Iceland spar, a type of calcite. Nobody knew what it was for. Years later, someone remembered the old Norse sagas. The saga of St. Olaf, written down in the 13th century, tells a story, where King Olaf needed to know the sun's position on a snowy, overcast day. He asked a man named Sigurdur. Sigurdur told him. To check, the king held up his solarstenen, his sunstone. He saw light emit from the stone. It showed him the sun's exact location, hidden behind the clouds. For a long time, historians thought this was just a myth. A magical stone in a heroic story. But the crystal from the 1592 shipwreck made them think again. Iceland spar has a property called birefringence. It splits a single ray of light into two. If you look through the crystal at a dot on a piece of paper, you see two dots. As you rotate the crystal, the dots move. On a cloudy day, even if the sun is completely hidden, some of its light is polarized. When this polarized light passes through the Iceland spar, the two images it creates have different brightness levels. The theory is that a Viking navigator could rotate the crystal until the two images were equally bright. At that point, the crystal's main axis would be pointing directly at the sun's hidden position. The puzzle isn't whether the science works. It does in a lab. The puzzle is whether it was a real navigational tool for the Vikings. The Alderney crystal is from 1592, almost 500 years after the Viking Age ended. We have never found a single piece of Iceland spar in a confirmed Viking grave or settlement. Not one. The sagas mention it, but sagas were written down long after the events they describe. They mix fact with fiction. So did Viking sailors really hold a crystal up to a gray sky hundreds of miles from land, trusting their lives to the faint glow within? Or is the sunstone just a beautiful story and the Alderney crystal a simple curiosity from a much later time? We still don't have the answer. It's one of many simple objects from that era that keeps us guessing. Number 20, they were found buried in the sand, but we don't know why. In 1831, a man named Malcolm MacLeod was walking on a beach in Uig Bay on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. A sandbank had recently collapsed, revealing something strange. It was a small dry stone chamber, like a tiny kiln. Inside, he found a hoard of small, intricately carved figures. They were made of walrus ivory and whale teeth, and MacLeod was reportedly frightened by their stern, ghoulish faces. He thought they were elves or spirits. He ran home. His wife encouraged him to go back, telling him they might be valuable. He did. The find became known as the Lewis Chessmen. There were 93 pieces in total. They form the bulk of 4 separate chess sets, though not quite complete. There are kings, queens, bishops, knights, and pawns. The rooks are not castles, as we know them today. They are fierce warriors called warders, some biting the tops of their shields in a frenzy. They look like berserkers. The craftsmanship is incredible. Each piece is a miniature sculpture. The queens look weary, their hands pressed to their cheeks. The kings are stoic and powerful. The bishops hold croziers. The detail is astonishing. Scholars have traced their style to Trondheim, Norway, and dated them to around 1150 to 1200 AD. At that time, the Isle of Lewis was part of the Norse kingdom of the Isles. The first puzzle is a simple one. Why were they buried? The hoard was found in a remote sandbank. It wasn't near any known settlement. One theory is that they were a merchant stock. Perhaps a trader from Norway was on his way to sell them in Ireland. He stopped at Lewis and buried his valuable goods for safekeeping, but something happened to him. He never came back. Another idea is that they belonged to a powerful local chieftain. He buried his treasure to hide it from an enemy or a tax collector. Again, he never returned to claim it. The way they were buried, in a purpose-built stone cist, suggests it was meant to be temporary storage, not a grave offering. But we have no idea who buried them or why they were abandoned. The second puzzle is about the pieces themselves. Why the expressions? Chess pieces are usually just functional tokens. These are full of personality. The worried queen, the berserker biting his shield. Was the carver just showing off his skill? Or did the expressions have some meaning in the game? Some have suggested they represented real people or political factions of the time. We have no way of knowing. The berserker rooks are particularly strange. They have no parallel in other medieval chess sets. They seem to be a uniquely Norse interpretation of the piece. And what about the missing pieces? We have almost 4 full sets. Where are the rest? Were they lost over time? Or was the hoard already incomplete when it was buried? The find was not professionally excavated. Malcolm MacLeod and his family dug the pieces out of the sand. It's possible some were lost then, or sold off separately before the main collection was acquired by the British Museum and the National Museum of Scotland. The entire story of their journey from a workshop in 12th century Norway to a sandbank in Scotland is a blank. The Lewis Chessmen are famous. You can see them in museums, you can buy replicas, but their personal history, the reason for their long sleep beneath the sand, is a complete mystery. Number 19, the sword was perfect, but its steel was impossible. In the early 9th century, a new kind of sword started appearing in the hands of Viking warriors. It was lighter, stronger, and sharper than anything else at the time. It was a weapon of immense prestige. On the blade, just below the hilt, an inscription was welded into the steel itself, plus Verbro. These are the Ulfberht swords. Archaeologists have found about 170 of them across Europe, from Ireland to Russia. They were made over a period of about 200 years, and for a long time nobody could figure out how they were made. The problem was the steel. Swords of that era were typically made from what's called pattern welded steel. A blacksmith would take strips of iron and low-carbon steel, twist them together, and forge them into a blade. This made the swords flexible, so they wouldn't shatter on impact, but they couldn't hold a very sharp edge. The Ulfberht swords were different. An analysis of an Ulfberht blade found in the 1960s shocked metallurgists. It was made of crucible steel. Crucible steel is made by melting iron with carbon in a sealed clay pot, or crucible. The process removes impurities like slag and creates a homogeneous high-carbon steel. It's incredibly strong and can be honed to a razor's edge. The process was thought to have been invented in the Middle East and Central Asia. It was the same kind of steel used to make the famous Damascus swords. European blacksmiths didn't master this technique until the Industrial Revolution almost 800 years later. So how did a Viking Age smith in the Frankish Empire, where the swords are thought to originate, make a blade from a material that shouldn't exist in Europe at that time? This is the central puzzle of the Ulfberht. One theory is that the raw material was imported. The Vikings had extensive trade routes. One of these, the Volga trade route, ran from Scandinavia down through modern-day Russia to the Caspian Sea. It connected them to the Abbasid Caliphate and the Samanid Empire in Central Asia. It's possible that ingots of crucible steel made in places like modern-day Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan traveled up this route. A master smith in the Rhineland, possibly named Ulfberht, then bought this exotic steel and forged it into superior swords, marking them with his name. But there are problems with this theory. The trade was mostly in furs, amber, and slaves going south, and silver coins and silks coming north. There's little archaeological evidence for a large-scale trade in steel ingots. It would have been an incredibly valuable and strategic material. Would the empires of the East really sell their best weapon-making material to the raiders from the north? Another puzzle is the inscription itself. The name Ulfberht is Frankish, not Norse. It was likely the brand name of a single, highly skilled workshop. But the swords were made for 200 years. That's too long for one person. It must have been a family or a guild that passed the name down. And there are copies. Many swords have been found with slightly different spellings, like Plufbert Plus with 2 crosses or with the letters rearranged. These fakes are made from the inferior pattern welded steel. It seems other smiths were trying to cash in on the Ulfberht reputation. It was the first known example of brand piracy. So we have a sword that was technologically ahead of its time. We think it was made in Francia, but with a type of steel that was only produced thousands of miles to the east. We don't know if the finished swords were traded or if the raw material was. The man or workshop named Ulfberht created a weapon so legendary that it was copied for generations. But the secret of how he got his steel died with him. Number 18, a woman was buried with an iron staff, but it wasn't a weapon. In 1986, archaeologists were excavating a major Viking fortress at Ulfberht in Denmark. They uncovered a cemetery with about 30 graves. One grave, number 4, was different from all the others. It was the burial of a high-status woman dated to the 10th century. She was buried in a long blue and red dress with fine gold and silver threads. She had silver toe rings. She was laid to rest in the body of a chariot or wagon, a very prestigious type of burial. Around her were a collection of unusual objects. She had a small purse containing seeds of henbane. Henbane is a plant in the nightshade family. It's a powerful hallucinogen and poison. She had a silver amulet shaped like a chair, perhaps a representation of a high seat or throne, and she had a long iron staff. It was about 82 centimeters long. It had a hollow iron knob at the top, which contained small bronze fittings. It wasn't a spear or a tool. It was a staff, a wand. This grave is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the existence of the völver, the sorceresses or sorceresses of the Viking world. The Norse sagas are full of stories about these powerful women. They could see the future, cast spells, and communicate with the gods. They were both respected and feared. The sagas often describe them carrying a staff, a seidstafr. The Völva's prophecy, the most famous poem in the Poetic Edda, begins with a seeress speaking about the creation and destruction of the world. In the saga of Eric the Red, a Völva named Thorbjorg visits a settlement in Greenland during a famine. She carries a staff with a brass-bound knob, wears a blue cloak, and has a bag of charms. The description matches the Ulfberht burial almost perfectly. The puzzle is what these staffs were actually for. Were they just a symbol of office, like a bishop's crozier? Or did they have a practical function in their rituals? The staff from Ulfberht is made of iron, a material often associated with magic and protection in Norse belief. The bronze elements inside the knob are a mystery. Perhaps they rattled, creating a sound during a ceremony. Some scholars suggest the staffs were distaffs, tools used for spinning wool, but reimagined as magical implements. Spinning itself was a magical act representing the spinning of the threads of fate. The Norns, the Norse fates, were often depicted as spinning. So a Völva's staff might be a symbolic distaff used to spin a prophecy. Another question is about the women themselves. Who were they? Were they part of an organized religious class, or were they independent practitioners? The Ulfberht woman was clearly very wealthy and respected. She was given a burial fit for a queen. Other graves with similar staffs have been found across Scandinavia, but not all are so lavish. It suggests that the role of a seeress could be a path to power and influence. The henbane seeds add another layer to the mystery. Ingesting henbane can cause hallucinations, delirium, and a sensation of flying. Was this how the Völva entered a trance state to communicate with the spirit world? It's a dangerous practice. A small overdose could be fatal. It implies a deep knowledge of herbalism and pharmacology. So we have these iron staffs found in the graves of powerful women. They are not weapons. They are not everyday tools. The sagas tell us they were carried by sorceresses, but the sagas were written by Christian men centuries later who may have exaggerated or misunderstood these pagan practices. The Ulfberht staff is a silent object. It gives us a direct link to a woman who lived 1,000 years ago. We can see what she wore, what she owned, but we cannot know what she did with that staff. We don't know the words she spoke, the songs she sang, or the futures she claimed to see. The staff is a tool, but its purpose remains locked in the world of belief and ritual. Number 17. They look like simple gaming pieces, but the rules are lost. Vikings loved games. The sagas mention them playing games of strategy to pass the long winter nights. Archaeologists find game boards and playing pieces in graves and settlements all the time. The most common game seems to have been Nefertafel. It was a game of strategy played on a gridded board. One player had a king in the center, surrounded by a small force of defenders. The other player had a larger force of attackers arranged around the edges. The goal for the defender was to get the king to a corner square. The goal for the attacker was to capture the king. We know the basics of the game because a version of it called tablut survived in Lapland until the 18th century, where it was documented by the naturalist Carl Linnaeus. Based on his notes, people have reconstructed the rules for Nefataflal. It seems like a fun asymmetrical war game. But there's a problem. Archaeologists keep finding gaming pieces that don't seem to fit Nefatafal. These pieces are often small, dome-shaped, and made of glass, bone, or stone. They are found in sets of various sizes. A famous example is the hoard of 40 glass gaming pieces found on the island of Gotland, Sweden. They are beautifully made, with swirls of color inside the glass, but 40 is the wrong number for Nefatafel. A typical set would have 37 pieces, 24 attackers, 12 defenders, and 1 king. This is the puzzle. What game were these other pieces used for? Was Nefatafel just one of many board games, and the rules for the others are completely lost? Or could the rules of Nefatafel itself have varied from place to place? Maybe in Gotland, they played a version with more pieces. Some of the pieces are particularly strange. In the Viking town of Birka in Sweden, archaeologists found small, spherical clay objects. They thought they might be weights for looms or fishing nets. But some were found with game boards suggesting they were playing pieces. How would you play a board game with little balls that could roll away? Another curious find is the use of bone. Many pieces are carved from whalebone or antler. They are often plain, just simple discs or pegs. But in some high-status graves, the pieces are elaborate. The king piece might be a carved animal or human figure. This suggests the quality of your game set was a status symbol. A chieftain might own a beautiful set made of walrus ivory, while a farmer played with smooth river stones. The boards themselves are also a source of confusion. We have found fragments of wooden boards with grids of 7x7, 9x9, 11x11, and even 13x13 squares. This supports the idea that there were many different versions of the game. But boards are rare finds. Wood rots. It's likely that most games were played on boards that were simply scratched into a dirt floor or a wooden table and have long since disappeared. The frustration for archaeologists is that they have all the equipment for a game, but no instruction manual. They have the board and the pieces, they can see the two opposing sides, but the subtle strategies, the specific moves, the names of the pieces, and the cultural meaning of the game are gone. Did these games reenact famous battles? Did they have a religious or divinatory meaning? Or were they just a way to gamble and have fun? And we can make educated guesses based on the tablut rules, but we'll probably never know for sure. It's like finding a chess set 1,000 years from now with no knowledge of how a knight moves or what checkmate means. The pieces are there, but the game is silent. Number 16, the Buddha, was on a bucket in Norway, but he came from far away. In 1904, a farmer on the Ulfberht farm near Tonsberg, Norway, reported a strange mound on his land. Archaeologists Gabriel Gustafsson and Håkon Skyttelig began to excavate. They uncovered the most spectacular Viking burial ever found. It was a 21.5-meter-long ship, exquisitely carved, buried under a mound of peat and stone. Inside were the remains of 2 women, one old and one younger, and a breathtaking collection of grave goods. The find, known as the Oseberg ship, dates to around 834 AD. Among the treasure sleighs, tapestries, animal head posts, beds, was a very unusual bucket. It was made of yew wood, held together by brass bands. The handle was attached to the bucket with 2 escutcheons, or mounts. And on these mounts were 2 small enameled figures. The figures were sitting cross-legged in what looks very much like the lotus position of Buddhist meditation. This object has become known as the Oseberg Buddha bucket. The first and most obvious puzzle is, what is a Buddha-like figure doing in a 9th century Viking grave in Norway? There is no other evidence of any Norse contact with Buddhist cultures at this time. Their trade routes went south to Byzantium and east to the Abbasid Caliphate, but not as far as India or China. The figures are not true representations of the Buddha. They are more likely a European artist's interpretation of a foreign motif. So where did the bucket come from? The dominant theory is that it is a piece of insular art, meaning it was made in either Ireland or Britain. The enameling technique, called champlive, was common in Celtic art of the period. The figures themselves, while sitting in a strange posture, have faces and clothing that look more Celtic than Asian. The idea is that Viking raiders plundered a monastery in Ireland. They took gold, silver, and other valuables. They probably saw this ornate bucket, liked it, and took it as well. They wouldn't have known or cared about the meaning of the figures on it. To them, it was just a fancy, well-made bucket, and then ended up as a prestigious grave gift for a powerful woman in Norway. But the Irish connection isn't certain. Some art historians argue that the style doesn't perfectly match known Irish metalwork from that period. The squat, stylized bodies are unusual. This has led to a second theory. The bucket was made by a Norse craftsman who was trying to copy an Irish style. Perhaps he had seen insular metalwork and was inspired by it, or maybe he was a Norseman living in Ireland who had learned the local techniques. This would make the bucket a fascinating example of cultural fusion. The function of the bucket is another small mystery. It was found with a ladle and a stash of wild apples inside. It seems to have been used for serving a drink, perhaps cider or mead, during the funeral feast. Its ornate design suggests it was a high-status object used on special occasions. The two women buried in the ship add to the intrigue. Who were they? The older woman seems to have been the more important one. She was perhaps a queen or a völva, a powerful seeress. The younger woman might have been her servant or a ritual sacrifice. We don't know. But whoever she was, the powerful woman owned an object that had traveled hundreds of miles across the sea. An object whose original creators in an Irish monastery would have been horrified to know it ended up in a pagan grave. The Oseberg Buddha bucket is a single object that tells a story of long-distance contact, violence, and cultural misunderstanding. The puzzle is that we can't be sure of the exact story. Was it loot? Was it a trade good? Was it a copy? The little cross-legged figures sit on their bucket, their faces blank. They are a tiny, enigmatic link between the worlds of Celtic monks, Viking raiders, and a Norwegian queen, but the precise nature of that link is lost. And number 15, they wore tiny weapons, but not for fighting. Viking graves are full of weapons. Swords, axes, and spears are common finds in male burials. They were the tools of a warrior's trade and symbols of his status. But archaeologists also find another kind of weapon miniatures. These are tiny, perfectly formed replicas of full-sized weapons. There are miniature swords, axes, and spears, often made of silver or bronze. They are usually found with a loop or a hole, showing they were worn as pendants or amulets. One of the most common types is the miniature axe. These are often associated with the god Thor and his hammer Mjolnir. Pendants of Thor's hammer are very common finds from the late Viking Age. They seem to have become popular as a symbol of Norse paganism in opposition to the Christian cross. But the miniature axes are often found in earlier contexts, and they are clearly axes, not hammers. This has led to some debate. Were these early forms of the Thor's hammer amulet, or did they have a different meaning? The puzzle is their exact purpose. Were they just jewelry? A warrior might wear a tiny silver axe to show his devotion to his favorite weapon. It could be a fashion statement, a way of showing off his identity as a warrior. but their frequent appearance in graves suggests they were more than just decoration. Another theory is that they were religious amulets offering protection to the wearer. The axe was a powerful symbol, not just of Thor, but of strength and power in general. Wearing a miniature axe might have been a way to invoke that power, to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. They are found in the graves of men, women, and children, which supports the idea that they were for general protection, not just for warriors. Some of the most intriguing miniature weapons are the swords. A miniature sword from the 10th century found in Tiso, Denmark, is a perfect little replica, complete with a hilt and crossguard. It's made of silver. What would this have meant to its owner? A full-size sword was an incredibly expensive and prestigious item. A young boy, not yet old enough to own a real sword, might have worn a miniature one as a promise of his future as a warrior. Or a man might wear one to show his allegiance to a chieftain who had gifted him a real sword. There's also the possibility that they were connected to legal or social oaths. In the sagas, men sometimes swear oaths on their swords. Perhaps a miniature sword served as a constant reminder of such an oath. It was a tangible piece of a contract, or a promise. The context of the finds can be confusing. A miniature spear was found in a female grave at Kostrup, Denmark. Why would a woman be buried with a weapon amulet? Perhaps it was a gift from a male relative, or maybe it symbolized a quality associated with the spear directness, purpose that was important to her. It challenges our simple assumptions about gender roles. These tiny objects are a reminder that the Viking world was full of symbolism and belief that is hard for us to access. A full-sized axe is easy to understand. You use it to fight or to chop wood, but a 2-inch-long silver axe has no practical function. Its purpose was entirely in the realm of ideas, identity, faith, protection, status. We find the objects, but the specific ideas they represented are hard to reconstruct. They are the echoes of a belief system we can only glimpse. Each tiny sword and axe is a question mark cast in metal. Number 14, the faces in the clay were not masks for people. In the great Viking trading town of Hedeby, in modern-day Germany, archaeologists have found some very strange ceramic objects. They are fragments of pottery, but they have been sculpted to look like human or animal faces. Some are grotesque with big noses and bared teeth. Others look more like grimacing masks. They are not masks for wearing. They are small, often part of a larger pot or vessel. They date from the 9th to the 11th centuries. The puzzle is what they were for. They are too elaborate to be simple decoration. They seem to have had a specific purpose, but we have no texts from Hedeby to tell us what it was. One of the main theories is that they are apotropaic, meaning they were intended to ward off evil. People would place these scary faces on their pottery or on the walls of their houses to frighten away evil spirits or bad luck. This kind of scary face magic is common in many cultures around the world. The gargoyles on a medieval cathedral have a similar purpose. Some of the faces were found on the outside of pots used for storage. Perhaps the face was there to protect the food or drink inside from spoiling or from being magically cursed. It was a kind of supernatural security system for the pantry. Another possibility is that they were connected to a specific cult or religious practice. Hedeby was a cosmopolitan place. People from all over Scandinavia, as well as Slavs, Frisians, and Saxons, lived and traded there. Now, it was a melting pot of different beliefs. These ceramic faces might have been idols or representations of household spirits or minor gods that were part of a local folk religion that we know nothing about. They could be the faces of trolls, goblins, or other supernatural beings. The style of the faces is also a mystery. They don't look like the stylized geometric animals of mainstream Viking art. They are more cartoonish, more expressive. Some scholars see similarities to masks used in folk traditions and theater in later periods. Is it possible these faces are related to some kind of performance or ritual drama? Perhaps there were festivals where people told stories of gods and monsters, and these ceramic faces were part of the props. And a particularly interesting find from Hedeby is a piece of pottery that seems to be a lid with a face sculpted on top. The face has a long, pointed beard. This has been interpreted by some as a depiction of the god Odin, who is often described as an old, bearded man. If so, it's a very rare thing. Representations of the Norse gods are surprisingly uncommon in Viking art. The faces are not unique to Hedeby. Similar ceramic masks have been found at other Viking age sites in Denmark and the Baltic region, but Hedeby has the largest concentration. This suggests it was a regional tradition. The clay faces of Hedeby are a puzzle because they represent a part of everyday life and belief that is completely absent from the sagas and the Eddas. The literature tells us about the great gods and epic heroes, but it tells us very little about the small-scale, domestic beliefs of ordinary people. What did a merchant in Hedeby do to protect his home from bad luck? What spirits did he believe inhabited his house? These little clay faces are a direct link to that lost world of folk magic and household religion. We can see the faces they made, but we can no longer hear the stories they told. For number 13, the skates were made of bone, but they had no blades. Across northern Europe, from London to Russia, archaeologists find curious objects in Viking Age and medieval settlements. They are long, smooth, and flat. They are made from the leg bones of horses or cattle, usually the metacarpal or metatarsal. One end is often shaped into a rough point, and there are sometimes holes drilled through them. For a long time, their purpose was a mystery. They were labeled as bond tools or pins. Then, someone realized what they were. They were ice skates. The sagas mention skating. In the Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson describes a Norwegian chieftain as a good skater. But the skates he was talking about were not like the steel-bladed skates we use today. They were these polished animal bones. The puzzle is how they actually worked. Unlike a modern skate, a bone skate has no sharp edge to bite into the ice. You can't propel yourself by pushing off to the side. Experiments with replicas have shown that trying to skate on them like modern skates is almost impossible. You just slide around uncontrollably, so how did the Vikings use them? The current understanding is that the skater would stand on the bone skates, which were tied to their feet through the drilled holes. They would then use a long pole or two poles with a sharp point on the end. You know, they would push themselves across the ice with the pole, much like a modern cross-country skier. The bone skates were not for propulsion, they were just for gliding. They reduced friction, allowing the user to travel long distances over frozen lakes and rivers with less effort than walking. And this makes sense, but it raises other questions. How efficient were they? Modern experiments have shown that you can achieve a decent speed, but it requires a lot of skill. It's not an easy thing to learn. Were they a common form of transport for everyone, or only for skilled specialists? The sheer number of them found suggests they were quite common. At the Viking site of Jorvik, modern-day York, England, archaeologists have found hundreds of bone skates. This indicates that the rivers Ouse and Foss, which run through York, must have frozen over regularly in the winter. Another puzzle is their dual purpose. Some of the skates show wear patterns that are not just from gliding. They have scratches and nicks that suggest they were also used as tools. Perhaps a skate could be used as a makeshift hand axe for cutting or as a wedge for splitting wood. Or maybe old, worn-out skates were just repurposed as tools. The evolution of the skate is also interesting. Some of the later examples from the 12th and 13th centuries have an iron blade inserted into the bottom of the bone. This was a transitional design, a hybrid between the simple bone glider and the modern metal-bladed skate. It shows that people were constantly experimenting and trying to improve the technology. The bone skates are a great example of Viking ingenuity and adaptation to their environment. They took a waste product, the leg bone of a butchered animal, and turned it into a useful tool for winter travel. They are not glamorous objects like a sword or a piece of jewelry. They are simple, functional, and made from a material that was readily available. But the exact technique for using them, the balance and skill required to glide across a frozen river with a pole, is a piece of body knowledge that has been lost. We can reconstruct the object, but we can't fully reconstruct the physical experience of using it. Number 12, the brooches were everywhere, but their meaning is debated. And if you were to pick one object to represent the Viking Age, a good choice would be the oval brooch. These are large, dome-shaped brooches, usually made of bronze, and often gilded. They were worn by women in pairs, one on each shoulder, to fasten the straps of an overdress called an hangeselkjol or apron dress. They are one of the most common finds in female Viking graves from the 9th and 10th centuries. Archaeologists have found thousands of them. They are decorated with intricate patterns of interlacing animals, a style known as gripping beast style. The animals twist and writhe, gripping each other and the frame of the brooch with their paws and mouths. The craftsmanship is often superb. They were mass-produced, cast in clay molds, but the designs vary widely. The puzzle is not what they were for. We know they were dress fasteners. The puzzle is what they meant. Why this specific shape and this specific style of decoration? Why were they so ubiquitous for a period of about 200 years, and then why did they disappear from fashion? One theory is that they were a powerful symbol of a woman's status as the mistress of a household. They were large, shiny, and worn in a prominent position on the chest. They were a visible sign of a woman's identity and her role in society. A string of glass or amber beads was often strung between the two brooches, further adding to the display of wealth. When a woman died, she was buried with her brooches, her keys to the farm's storehouses, and other symbols of her domestic authority. The brooches were a fundamental part of her identity. But what about the gripping beast decoration? This style of art is found on all sorts of Viking objects, from wood carvings to sword hilts. It's energetic, chaotic, and sometimes hard to decipher. What did these writhing animals mean to the people who looked at them every day? Some art historians think the style has a magical protective function. The confusing, knotted patterns were meant to trap evil spirits, to protect the wearer from harm. The fierce beasts themselves could have been seen as powerful guardians. So the brooches were not just fasteners, they were amulets. Another puzzle is their regional variation. Different styles of oval brooches are associated with different parts of Scandinavia. An archaeologist can often tell if a woman came from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark just by looking at the type of brooches she was buried with. When a Norwegian-style brooch is found in a grave in Iceland or Scotland, it's a clear sign that the woman was a colonist or an immigrant. The brooches were like a passport, showing where you came from. Why did they go out of fashion? Around the year 1000, oval brooches start to disappear. Fashions changed, and the apron dress was replaced by more European-style clothing that didn't require the big shoulder brooches. The rise of Christianity also played a role. The new religion brought with it new symbols like the cross and a new aesthetic. The chaotic, pagan world of the gripping beasts was replaced by the more ordered art of Christian Europe. So while we have thousands of these objects and we know how they were worn, their deeper meaning is still a subject of debate. Were they a statement of ethnic identity, a symbol of marital status, a magical charm, or just a piece of fashionable jewelry? They were probably all of these things at once. The oval brooch is a common object, but it's also a complex cultural artifact that reflects the identity, beliefs, and artistic world of the Viking woman. Number 11, the rings had pins, but they weren't just for clothes. Archaeologists find a lot of pins in Viking age contexts, simple bone pins, bronze pins, and iron pins. They were used for fastening cloaks and other garments. But there is one type of pin that is particularly distinctive and somewhat puzzling. It's called the ring pin. It consists of a long pin, often with a decorated head that passes through a small, loose ring. They are most commonly found in areas of Norse settlement in the west, meaning Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and England. They are much rarer in Scandinavia itself. This suggests they were a product of the cultural mix in the British Isles, a Hiberno-Norse or Anglo-Scandinavian fashion. The basic function is clear. You would push the pin through the folds of a heavy cloak, then you would pass the pin through the ring, and when you let go, the weight of the fabric would pull on the pin, causing the ring to jam against it, locking it in place. It's a simple and effective fastener. The puzzle is why they became so popular and why they took on so many elaborate forms. Some ring pins are very simple, just a bronze pin and a plain ring, but others are masterpieces of metalworking. The ring might be decorated with intricate patterns, the pinhead might be shaped like an animal's head or a geometric design. Some are made of silver and are clearly high-status items. One theory is that they were more than just a clothes fastener. They were a versatile tool. You know, a man might use his ring pin to fasten his cloak, but also as a personal eating utensil, you know, like a skewer for meat. The long, sharp point would be useful for all sorts of small tasks. The ring itself could have been used as a form of currency. Some of the rings are hack silver, meaning they were cut from a larger piece of silver. A Viking might have a large silver ring on his pin, and if he needed to buy something, he could snip off a piece of the ring and use it as payment. The social significance of the pins is also debated. Because they are so common in the Norse settlements of Britain and Ireland, they have become a kind of archaeological signature of a Viking presence. Wearing a ring pin was a way of showing your cultural affiliation. It marked you as part of the Norse Gaelic world. But who wore them? They are mostly found in male graves, suggesting they were primarily a male accessory used for fastening the heavy woolen cloaks that were standard outerwear. But some have been found in female graves too, and their design seems to have been influenced by both Irish and Scandinavian traditions, making them a true hybrid object. One of the most elaborate types is the thistle brooch, a type of ring pin where the pinhead is shaped like a thistle. These are often made of silver and are beautifully crafted. They were popular in the 10th century. Why a thistle? It's a plant native to Scotland. Perhaps the design originated there and became fashionable throughout the Norse world. The ring pin is a simple object with a complex story. It shows how Vikings and the people they settled amongst influenced each other. It's a story of cultural exchange, not just raiding and conquest, but the full range of its uses is hard to know for sure. Was it a wallet? A fork? A status symbol? A cultural badge? It was a simple pin, but it seems to have played many different roles in the life of a Viking in the West. The variety and beauty of these pins suggest they were an important part of how people presented themselves to the world. Number 10. The stones have pictures, but we cannot read them. On the island of Gotland, in the Baltic Sea, there are hundreds of strange stone monuments. They are tall, flat slabs of limestone, often carved into a distinctive shape with a long neck and a rounded head, a bit like a mushroom or a keyhole. They are covered in carved images. These are the Gotland picture stones. They were erected between the 5th and the 12th centuries, with the most elaborate ones dating to the Viking Age. The puzzle of the picture stones is simple. What do they mean? They are a rich and detailed source of imagery, a kind of Viking Age comic book carved in stone. But we have no text to explain the pictures. We have to try to interpret them by comparing them to the Norse myths that were written down in Iceland hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. The stones are covered with scenes. There are ships with full sails and rows of warriors. There are men on horseback, often with a woman holding a drinking horn to greet them. There are battles, sacrifices, and strange multi-legged animals. A recurring image is that of a man on an 8-legged horse. This is almost certainly the god Odin riding his horse Sleipnir. This suggests the stones are mythological in content. One of the most famous stones, the Stora Hamar's stone, shows a series of violent scenes. In one panel, a man is lying on a block while another man with a sword stands over him. An eagle-like bird hovers nearby. This has been interpreted as a depiction of the Blood Eagle, a brutal ritual execution mentioned in the sagas. In another panel, warriors are shown hanging from a tree, another scene associated with Odin, the god of the hanged. The theory is that these stones are memorials. They were erected in memory of a dead chieftain or a family member. But they are not gravestones. They are not usually found directly associated with graves. They seem to have been placed at important locations like bridges, crossroads, or assembly places. They were public monuments, so what story are they telling? Are they telling the life story of the person they commemorate? Here is his last battle, here is his journey to the afterlife. Or are they telling a mythological story that was important to that person's family? A story about Odin, or Thor, or the heroes Sigurd and Gunnar. The scene of the woman with the drinking horn is particularly common. It's often interpreted as a Valkyrie welcoming a dead warrior to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. This would support the idea that the stones depict the journey to the afterlife. The ship, another very common motif, could be the ship that carries the dead to the other world, but there are other interpretations. Some scholars believe the stones are not just about death. They could be about myths of creation, or about political alliances, or even legal claims to land. Without any accompanying text, it's very hard to be sure. The carvers and their audience shared a common visual language that is now lost to us. And they knew what the man on the eight-legged horse meant. They knew the story of the hanging men. We can make educated guesses by linking them to the later myths, but we might be wrong. The stories on Gotland in the 8th century might have been different from the stories written down in Iceland in the 13th. The Gotland picture stones are a tantalizing glimpse into the visual world of the Vikings. They show us their ships, their weapons, their clothing. They show us their gods and their myths, but they are silent. They are a library of stories where all the books have lost their words, leaving only the illustrations. Number 9, the glass beads were tiny, but their creation is a big puzzle. Viking age graves, especially female ones, are often filled with beads. Long strings of them were worn between the oval brooches, and they were also used for necklaces and bracelets. And, they came in all sorts of materials: amber, jet, carnelian, and bone. But the most common and the most puzzling are the glass beads. Archaeologists have found hundreds of thousands of them. Some are simple monochrome beads, usually blue or green, but many are incredibly intricate. There are mosaic beads made from fused rods of colored glass to create checkerboard or floral patterns. There are eye beads with spots of a different color, and there are beads with fine trails of glass wrapped around them, sometimes in a crisscross pattern. Many of these beads are tiny, only a few millimeters across. The first puzzle is where they came from. For a long time, it was assumed that most of the glass beads were imported. Glassmaking was a complex, high-temperature industry. Major centers existed in the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East. It was thought that the Vikings traded for these beads, bringing them back to Scandinavia along with silk and silver. The beads were exotic luxury goods. But in recent years, this view has been challenged. Archaeologists have found evidence of glassworking at several Viking Age sites, including Ribe in Denmark and Paviken in Gotland. They have found crucibles with traces of melted glass, unfinished beads, and glass rods called tesserae, which were the raw material for making mosaic beads. This suggests that the Vikings were not just importing finished beads, they were making their own. This leads to the second, bigger puzzle. How did they do it? Making a simple single-color bead is relatively straightforward. You can melt glass and wind it around a metal rod. But creating the complex mosaic and trailed beads requires a much higher level of skill and technology. The workshops found so far seem to be small-scale operations. How did these local artisans achieve such fine detail? The raw glass itself seems to have been imported. The Vikings would bring in broken glass from the Middle East or Roman ruins, sort it by color, melt it down, and then rework it into new beads. They were master recyclers, but the techniques they used to create the intricate patterns are still not fully understood. And some of the mosaic beads, for example, have patterns that are incredibly small and precise. It would have required a steady hand and a deep understanding of how the glass behaves when heated. Another mystery is the gold foil beads. These are beads made of clear glass with a tiny piece of gold or silver foil trapped inside. They are beautiful objects. How did a craftsman in 9th century Ribe manage to sandwich a fragile piece of metal foil inside molten glass without it burning up or wrinkling? The sheer number of beads is also staggering. A single grave can contain hundreds of them. This suggests they weren't all fantastically expensive luxury items. Some of the simpler beads were probably quite affordable. It seems bead making was a significant industry. The glass beads are a testament to the skill of Viking age craftspeople. They show that the Vikings were not just raiders and traders, they were also sophisticated artisans. But the exact methods they use, the organization of their workshops, and the full extent of their trade in raw and finished glass are still being pieced together. Each tiny, colorful bead is a piece of a puzzle about technology, trade, and art in the Viking world. Number 8. The collars were made of iron, but were they for slaves? In a handful of Viking age graves in Sweden and on the island of Gotland, archaeologists have found a disturbing object. It is a heavy iron collar with a lock mechanism. It is often found around the neck of the deceased. These collars are often found with other iron restraints like manacles and leg irons. For a long time, the interpretation seemed obvious. These were the graves of slaves. Slavery was a major part of the Viking economy. The Vikings raided and traded for slaves all across Europe. People from Ireland, England, and the Slavic lands were captured and sold in markets from Dublin to the Caspian Sea. The Old Norse word for a slave was thrall. The sagas are full of references to them. They were a form of property, and they had no rights. So, finding a person buried in chains seems to fit this picture perfectly. The collar was a symbol of their unfree status, a mark they carried with them, even into the afterlife. Some of these burials are very simple, with no other grave goods, which would also fit the low status of a slave. But the puzzle is that some of these burials are not simple at all. A famous grave from Birka in Sweden contained a man with an iron collar and a massive padlock around his neck. But he was also buried with a full set of weapons, including a sword and an axe. He was laid to rest in a wooden chamber. This was not the burial of a typical low-status slave. It was the burial of a warrior. This complicates the story. Why would a man of warrior status be buried in a slave collar? One theory is that these were not ordinary slaves, but important hostages or prisoners of war. That perhaps a captured enemy chieftain was kept in chains and then, after his death, was buried with the symbols of his captivity. Another, more unsettling theory is that these were human sacrifices. The sagas describe sacrifices to the gods, sometimes on a grand scale. The 11th century writer Adam of Bremen described a great temple at Uppsala in Sweden where men and animals were hung from trees as offerings. Perhaps these chained individuals were retainers or slaves who were sacrificed to accompany their master into the next world. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who met Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, described the funeral of a chieftain where a slave girl was killed and burned with her master on his ship. The iron collars could be evidence of a similar grim practice. A third possibility is that the collars had a meaning that we don't understand. Perhaps they were not slave collars at all, but some kind of ritual object. In some contexts, chains and collars can be symbols of a bond or an oath. Maybe these men were sworn retainers of a powerful lord, and the collar symbolized their unbreakable loyalty even in death. It's a less likely theory, but it's hard to be certain. The locks themselves are also interesting. They are complex puzzle locks designed to be difficult to open without the right key or technique. This suggests they were meant for high security imprisonment. The iron collars are a stark and difficult part of the Viking archaeological record. They are a direct link to the brutality of the age, but their presence in high-status warrior graves is a genuine puzzle. They force us to ask difficult questions about the relationship between slavery, status, and ritual violence in the Viking world. Was it possible to be both a warrior and a slave? Were these men honored victims or despised enemies? The iron collars are silent on the matter. Number 7. They buried their dead in ships, but we don't know who they all were. One of the most iconic images of the Viking Age is the ship burial. A powerful chieftain or queen would be laid to rest in a real full-sized ship, surrounded by their treasures, and then covered with a massive mound of earth. The Ulfberht and Gokstad ships in Norway are the most famous examples. These were clearly the burials of the highest elite, probably royalty. But in 2018, archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar made a stunning discovery at Gjellestad in Norway. They found the clear outline of a 20-meter-long Viking ship buried just 50 centimeters below the surface of a farmer's field. The Jelistad ship burial quickly became a major excavation project. The wooden ship itself was almost completely gone. Over 1,000 years in the soil, the timber had rotted away, leaving only the iron rivets and a dark stain in the clay. But the outline was perfect. Archaeologists could trace the shape of the hull and the keel. They also found the remains of a burial chamber built in the middle of the ship. The first puzzle is who was buried there. The bones that have been found so far are just small, degraded fragments. It's not yet clear if they belonged to a man or a woman or how old they were. Unlike the Oseberg burial, which was preserved in waterlogged clay, the Jelistad site is dry. The organic material, including the body and most of the grave goods, has not survived well. So the identity of the person who was given this magnificent burial is, for now, a mystery. The second puzzle is the date. Radiocarbon dating of the keel suggests the tree was felled sometime after 733 AD, but the burial itself probably happened in the 9th or 10th century, the height of the Viking Age. It was a time of great wealth and power for the chieftains of this region. The person buried at Jelistad was clearly someone of immense importance. What makes Jelistad particularly intriguing is its context. The ship mound is part of a larger landscape of power. It sits next to a much larger mound, the Gel Mound, which dates to the 5th or 6th century, the period before the Viking Age. The Vikings who buried their leader in the ship at Jelistad were deliberately making a connection to this older ancestral burial ground. They were using the past to legitimize their own power. The excavation is still ongoing and new discoveries are being made. Archaeologists have found a few grave goods, including some animal bones, likely from a horse or ox sacrificed at the funeral, and a single blue glass bead. The lack of spectacular gold and silver finds so far might mean the grave was looted in antiquity. Grave robbing was common. A large mound like Jelistad would have been a tempting target. The Jelistad ship is a puzzle in progress. It's a major discovery that is changing our understanding of the Viking presence in this part of Norway. But the central character of the story is missing. We have the stage, the magnificent ship, and the monumental mound. We have the setting a landscape steeped in history and power, but we don't have the main actor, the person whose death prompted this enormous expenditure of wealth and labor remains anonymous. It's a reminder that even the grandest archaeological sites can keep their deepest secrets. Number 6, the combs were often broken, perhaps on purpose. Combs are one of the most common objects found on Viking Age sites. They are usually made of antler or bone. They are often beautifully made with a handle and 2 sides of teeth, one coarse and one fine. They were personal items, used for grooming hair and beards. A well-groomed appearance was important to the Vikings. An Arab diplomat who met them in Russia described them as the filthiest of God's creatures, but other sources praise their cleanliness. The number of combs we find suggests they cared about their hair. They are often found in graves for both men and women. They were part of a person's essential kit, something they would need in the afterlife. Many combs are decorated with simple geometric patterns like circles and dots. They were kept in a leather or antler case to protect the teeth. The puzzle is why so many of them are found broken. And in many cases, it's easy to explain. They are fragile objects, and after 1,000 years in the ground, they can easily break. But archaeologists have noticed a pattern. Combs are often found deliberately broken, snapped in half, and then placed in a grave or a settlement deposit. This seems to be a ritual act. Why would someone deliberately break a perfectly good comb and then bury it? One theory is that it was part of the funeral rite. Breaking an object kills it, releasing its spirit so it can accompany the dead person into the next world. We see this with other objects too. Swords are sometimes bent or broken before being placed in a grave. The act of breaking the comb was a way of decommissioning it from the world of the living. Another possibility is that the breaking of the comb had a more specific magical meaning. In folklore, hair is often associated with a person's strength or soul. A comb, as an object that is intimately connected with a person's hair, might have been seen as holding a part of their essence. Breaking the comb after their death could have been a way to sever their connection to the world, to ensure their ghost did not return to haunt the living. The context of the finds is important. Broken combs are not just found in graves, they are also found in pits in settlements, sometimes with other objects that seem to be part of a ritual deposit. This suggests that the act of breaking a comb might have been part of other ceremonies as well, perhaps to mark the end of a relationship or to seal an oath. Not all combs are broken. Many are found intact. This makes the pattern of deliberate breakage even more intriguing. It was a choice. Sometimes you buried the comb whole, and sometimes you broke it. What determined that choice? Was it the status of the person, the cause of death? A specific family tradition? We don't know. The simple, everyday bone comb is a window into the Viking mind. It shows us their concern for appearance and their skill in craft, but the broken ones show us something else. They show us a world of ritual and belief that is hard for us to enter. The act of snapping a comb in two was a meaningful gesture. It was a communication with the supernatural world, but the language of that gesture is now lost. Number 5, the little stone. Had runes, but its use is a mystery. Spindle whorls are common finds on Viking sites. They are small, flywheel-like objects, usually made of stone, bone, or ceramic. They have a hole in the middle. A wooden spindle would be pushed through the hole, and the whorl would provide the weight to keep the spindle turning as a woman spun wool or flax into thread. Spinning was a fundamental female activity. It was a constant, necessary task to produce the yarn for clothing, sails, and ropes. Most spindle whorls are plain and functional. They are just a simple disc or sphere of soapstone or sandstone. But some are different. Some are decorated with patterns, and a very small number have runes carved on them. A famous example was found in the 1970s in a Viking age layer during excavations in Lincoln, England. It's a small lead spindle whorl. Carved on it are runes that read, "Thorgeir owns me Thorin." Another one from a different site reads, "Good friend." The puzzle is why anyone would carve runes on a spindle whorl. It's a humble, everyday tool. It's not a prestige object like a sword or a brooch. So why go to the trouble of inscribing it? One theory is that it was simply a mark of ownership. In a household with several women spinning, it was a way to know whose spindle whorl was whose. This one is mine, owned by Thorin. This makes practical sense. But the inscriptions seem to be more than just labels. The Lincoln whorl names two people, a man, and a woman. Thorgeir owns me, Thorin. Who is who? Is Thorgeir the owner, and Thorin is the name of the whorl itself, personified as a female being? Or did Thorgeir make the whorl and give it as a gift to Thorin? The grammar is ambiguous. It suggests a personal relationship. This leads to another theory: the runes had a magical purpose. Spinning itself was seen as a magical act connected to the spinning of fate by the Norns. Perhaps the runes on the whorl were a spell, a charm to ensure that the thread spun true and strong, or to protect the spinner from harm. An inscription like "Good friend" could be an appeal to the object itself, asking it to work well. The material of the whorls might also be significant. Soapstone was a common material, easy to carve, but why lead like the Lincoln whorl? Lead was a material sometimes associated with magic and curses in the Roman and medieval world. The fact that so few whorls have runes on them makes the inscribed ones even more special. It wasn't a common practice. It was something that only a few people did. Was it a private, personal act of magic? A lover's gift? These small inscribed objects give us a rare glimpse into the personal lives and beliefs of Viking women. The sagas are mostly about men, kings, warriors, and chieftains. The archaeological record of women is often limited to their graves and their tools. And a runic spindle whorl is a tool that speaks. It carries a name, a relationship, a message, but the full meaning of that message is unclear. It's a whisper from 1,000 years ago, a fragment of a conversation between a man, a woman, and the everyday object that connected them. Number 4, the fire steels were beautiful, but unnecessarily so. To make a fire in the Viking Age, you needed 3 things: a piece of flint, some tinder like dry fungus, and a fire steel. The fire steel was a piece of carbon-rich iron. You would strike the flint against the edge of the steel, creating a spark. You would catch the spark in the tinder and then blow it into a flame. It was a vital piece of technology. Every household and probably every traveler would have had one. Most fire steels are simple and functional. They are usually a C-shaped or U-shaped bar of iron. You would hold the bar in your hand and strike the flat bottom edge. They are common archaeological finds. But some fire steels are anything but simple. Archaeologists have found a number of highly decorated, elaborate fire steels. They are often shaped like animals. The 2 ends of the U shape might be formed into stylized horse heads or dragon heads. They are sometimes decorated with inlaid silver or copper wire. They're beautiful objects, far more ornate than they need to be for their practical purpose. The puzzle is why. Why would a Viking craftsman lavish so much attention on a simple utilitarian tool? You don't need a dragon-headed fire steel to make a fire. A plain bar of iron works just as well. One theory is that it was a matter of status. Like a fancy sword or a decorated drinking horn, a beautiful fire steel was a way to show off your wealth and taste. Fire was central to life. It provided warmth, light, and cooked food. The ability to make fire was a form of power. Owning a magnificent tool for making fire could have been a symbol of that power and control. These ornate fire steels are often found in the graves of wealthy men, alongside their weapons and other high-status goods. Another theory is that the decoration had a magical or religious meaning. Fire itself was a mysterious and powerful force. It was associated with gods and spirits. The dragon heads on the fire steel might have been a form of protection. The dragon was a powerful creature in Norse mythology, like the serpent Jormungandr that encircled the world. And by shaping the fire steel like a dragon, the owner might have been trying to control the powerful and dangerous element of fire. The act of striking a spark could have been seen as a small act of creation, and the decorated tool was part of that ritual. The animal shapes are also interesting. Horses were very important animals associated with fertility, death, and the gods. A horse-headed fire steel might be a way of invoking the protective power of the horse. These objects are a good example of the Viking love for decorated surfaces. They seem to have disliked plain things. Even the most everyday objects like a bucket handle or a wooden chair were often covered in intricate carving. The decorated fire steels show that this artistic impulse extended to even the most basic tools. So were they status symbols, magical amulets, or just examples of a love for art? The answer is probably a mix of all 3. A Viking chieftain would have wanted his fire steel to be not only functional, but also beautiful and magically potent. The object had to work on a practical level, but it also had to work on a social and a spiritual level. The ornate fire steel is a reminder that in the Viking world, the line between the practical and the symbolic was often blurred. Number 3, the small spears from Birka have no obvious use. The Viking town of Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, was one of the most important trading centers of the era. Excavations there have revealed a wealth of artifacts from all over the known world. But among the swords, silks, and silver coins, archaeologists have found some much more humble and mysterious objects. They are small spherical objects made of fired clay or stone. They are about the size of a large marble. The puzzle is, what were they for? They don't have an obvious function. They are too small and light to be effective weights for a loom or a fishing net. They are not beads. They don't have holes. They are not ammunition for a sling. They are not the right shape or material. One of the main theories is that they were gaming pieces. We know the Vikings played board games like Nefertafel. Perhaps these spheres were used for a game we no longer know the rules to. It's hard to imagine how you would play a stable board game with pieces that can roll around, but it's a possibility. Another idea is that they were used for counting or for some form of calculation. They could be used on an abacus-like counting board. A merchant in Burka would have needed to do calculations to keep track of his goods and his profits. These simple spheres could have been the tools of his trade. A third possibility is that they were used as some kind of token or voucher. In a bustling market town, you might need a system for proving you had paid for a service or a toll. A small, distinctive clay ball could serve that purpose. Some of the spheres have been found inside houses near the hearth. This has led to the suggestion that they were used in cooking. They could be heated in the fire and then dropped into a pot of water or stew to heat it up. This technique, using pot boilers, is known from other cultures. It's a way to cook food in a container that can't be placed directly on a fire, like a leather bag or a wooden trough. The clay spheres are the right size and material for this. The problem is that none of these theories is conclusive. There is no direct evidence to support any of them over the others. They are found in various contexts all over the site. They are a common everyday object, but their purpose is completely obscure. It's a good example of the challenge of archaeology. It's easy to get excited about the spectacular finds, the treasure hoards, and the ship burials. They tell us about the powerful and the wealthy, but the lives of ordinary people were filled with simple, mundane objects, and sometimes, these are the hardest to understand. A sword is a sword, a pot is a pot, but a small clay ball with no clear function is a complete mystery. It's a piece of the everyday life of Burka that has become disconnected from its meaning. Number 2, the Valkyrie brooches might not be Valkyries at all. In the late Viking Age, a new type of brooch became popular in Scandinavia. It was a three-dimensional figural brooch, usually made of gilded silver. The figures depicted are almost always women, with their hair tied in a distinctive knot at the back of their heads. They are often holding a drinking horn. Because of their martial appearance and the connection to the drinking horn today, a symbol of welcome to Valhalla, these figures have been interpreted as Valkyries. Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, were female figures in Norse mythology who served Odin. They would ride over battlefields and choose which warriors would die and be taken to Valhalla. There, they would serve the chosen warriors mead and ale. The brooches seem to be a perfect depiction of this scene. The puzzle is, are they really Valkyries? The term Valkyrie brooch is a modern invention by archaeologists. The Vikings themselves left no label. While the interpretation is appealing, there are some problems with it. First, the figures are always depicted alone. In the myths, Valkyries usually appear in groups. Second, they are often shown in long, elaborate dresses, not armor. They look more like noblewomen than supernatural warrior maidens. The drinking horn, while associated with Valhalla, was also a symbol of a high-status hostess welcoming guests to a feast. This has led to an alternative theory. The brooches do not depict mythological beings, but real, powerful women. They could be representations of the lady of the estate, the powerful matriarch of a clan. The brooch would be a symbol of her authority and her role as the manager of the household and the dispenser of hospitality. A third possibility is that they represent something in between. They might depict priestesses or women who performed religious rituals, acting as human representatives of the divine Valkyries. The wearer of the brooch might be identifying herself with the power and status of the Valkyrie. The distinctive hairstyle is another clue. The knot of hair at the back of the head is very specific. Some have suggested it's a marker of a particular social group or religious role. The brooches are also part of a wider trend in late Viking Age art. As Christianity began to spread, Norse paganism seems to have become more explicit and organized. People started wearing Thor's hammer pendants and perhaps these Valkyrie brooches as a way of publicly stating their adherence to the old faith. The brooch was a badge of identity in a time of religious change, so we are left with a beautiful and enigmatic object. Is it a picture of a mythical being, a portrait of a real noblewoman, or a symbol of a religious office? It could be any of these. The brooch shows a powerful female figure, but her exact identity, divine or human, remains a matter of interpretation. It highlights how difficult it is to be certain about the meaning of religious or mythological art when the culture that produced it is gone. Number 1, the wooden posts from Ulfberht are masterpieces, but their purpose is baffling. The Ulfberht ship burial from 834 AD, the same grave that contained the Buddha bucket, also held a collection of 5 mysterious wooden objects. Well, they are posts carved from single pieces of maple wood. Each post is about 50 centimeters tall. The top of each post is carved into the head of a snarling, roaring animal. The carving is of breathtaking quality. They are some of the finest examples of Viking age wood carving ever found. 4 of the heads are very similar, with round eyes, curling snouts, and bared teeth. They are covered in the complex, interlacing, gripping beast patterns that are typical of the era. The 5th head is different. It is longer, more slender, and more realistic. It has been nicknamed the Academic because of its more thoughtful, less ferocious expression. Each post has a handle carved at the bottom so it could be held and carried. They were found in the burial chamber of the ship, near the heads of the 2 buried women. The puzzle is simple and profound. What are they? They are clearly objects of great importance. The quality of the carving shows that they were made by a master craftsman. They were buried in the grave of a queen or a priestess, but we have no idea what they were used for. One theory is that they were ritual staffs, similar in function to the iron völva staffs found in other graves. The powerful women buried in the Ulfberht ship may have used these animal-headed posts in religious ceremonies. The terrifying animal heads could have been meant to channel animal spirits or to ward off evil forces during a ritual. When carried in a procession, they would have been a fearsome and impressive sight. Another theory is that they were architectural elements. Perhaps they were decorative posts from a throne, a high seat, or a religious building. When the queen died, these important symbols of her power were taken from their original setting and buried with her. The problem with this theory is the handles. They seem to be designed for carrying, not for being fixed to a piece of furniture. A third idea, which has become less popular, is that they were part of the ship's equipment. Perhaps they were decorative tiller handles or some other part of the ship's rigging, but their location in the burial chamber, not with the rest of the ship's gear, makes this unlikely. The identity of the animals is also debated. Are they dragons, wolves, mythical beasts with no specific name? The gripping beast style is so abstract that it's often hard to tell exactly what is being depicted. The heads are a blend of real and imaginary features, designed to be powerful and unsettling. These 5 wooden heads are a perfect example of the limits of archaeological interpretations. We have the objects themselves preserved in miraculous condition for over 1,000 years. We can analyze the wood, study the tool marks of the carver, and admire the artistic skill. We know their context. They were buried with a very powerful woman, but their function, their name, and their meaning are completely lost. They are silent witnesses to a ritual or a belief system that has vanished without a trace. They are pure Viking art, full of power and mystery, but with no instruction manual attached.